When the preservation team arrived at the overgrown foundations of the old Greystone Institute in the spring of 1890, they expected nothing more than vines, crumbled bricks, and the usual relics of a long-abandoned structure. The place had been declared unfit for reconstruction decades earlier, its soil deemed unstable, its records lost to time. But what they found wasn't erosion. It was memory buried boxed and sealed with intent. The eastern wing's root cellar, long thought to have collapsed during a flood, was discovered almost intact beneath a thicket of white grass, an invasive species known never to bloom anywhere else in Yorkshire. Hidden beneath a layer of stone and rusted tools, they found crates. Inside those crates were patient files, over 300 of them documented from 1872 through 1888. Some were still legible, sealed in oilcloth. Others had handwritten notes in margins that didn't belong to any known staff of the Institute. But it wasn't just the files. There were sketches, diagrams of the human brain cross-sectioned with strange spiral annotations. Musical notations written in red ink marked subject responsive at 3:03. Some folders included small glass vials filled with what looked like ash but too fine, too pale. And there, atop the final crate, was a tarnished brass plaque. It read 305 souls, aligned, transferred, released. No one knew who wrote it. No one had claimed authority over the ruins for years. But when investigators sent word to the county medical board, they received a surprising reply, a sealed envelope with no return address, only a note inside. I was the last to leave. If you wish to understand what happened beneath the stones of Greystone, listen carefully. Not just with your ears. With your doubt. That's where our story begins. This isn't a tale of ghosts or haunted corridors, though by the end you might wish it were. What unfolded at Greystone between 1872 and 1888 was real. Documented. Hidden. And it may not be finished. Because some patterns don't end, they just move underground. Before we start, I want to say this channel dives deep into long-buried truths. Forgotten medical histories, fractured belief systems, and institutions that claim to heal when they were really harvesting. If you're someone who isn't afraid to look at what the world tried to cover up, subscribe now. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been to a place that felt like it remembered more than you did? A place that seemed to breathe when no one was watching. This one did. Let's begin with the story of a man named Alaric Venn. The founder of Greystone Institute, once hailed as a pioneer of emotional restoration. But sometimes restoration is just rewriting with a sharper pen. And sometimes the cure is worse than the silence. In the spring of 1872, a stranger arrived in the village of Bellwether-on-Firth, nestled between the mist-draped moors of northern Yorkshire. He arrived not with ceremony but with precision by private rail car, which stopped only long enough for a single trunk and a tall man in a dark wool coat to step down. He introduced himself as Dr. Alaric Venn. No one knew the name. The village had no hospital, no formal physician, only an apothecary and a midwife. But when Venn took residence in the vacant Greystone estate, a massive stone structure built decades earlier as a boarding school for troubled youth, he claimed he was there to ease the burden of disordered minds. His papers were in order. His speech, clipped and elegant, bore the inflection of upper-class London, though no one could place the precise origin. He never spoke of his childhood nor his education, only of what he called neural reverberation theory, a method he said not to suppress madness, but to recalibrate the mind's echo. He began seeing patients almost immediately. Veterans, mostly those returned from the Indian front or the Abyssinian campaign, broken not in body, but in memory. Venn never prescribed laudanum or leeches. Instead, he placed them in darkened rooms with silver-lined panels, then exposed them to carefully tuned harmonic frequencies. Some patients wept, some screamed, others sat still unmoving for hours until something inside them cracked and was rebuilt. Venn called these episodes clearings, and when the patients emerged days later, many were changed. The village saw the difference. Men who'd once muttered to themselves now strolled the green in silence. A woman who had tried to drown her infant sang lullabies without trembling. The apothecary, Mr. Whitlow, began referring his most difficult cases to Venn without hesitation. But no one ever entered Greystone's lower halls. Venn insisted some treatments required environmental sterilization and that not all methods were meant for common observation. Even his staff was carefully curated nurses who arrived on private carriages, silent men in gray coats who answered only to him. The first rumors began 6 months in. A stable boy claimed he'd seen a man carried into Greystone on a stretcher after sunset and never come out. The next morning, Venn spoke at the parish, calmly announcing that the man had been released. His suffering resolved his soul aligned. That word aligned began to replace cured in the village. By winter, Venn had formally renamed the estate Greystone Therapeutic Institute for cognitive realignment. A carved plaque was installed above the door. It read, "Through silence sound. Through sound clarity." Few questioned it. The results were tangible. But others, like Mrs. Marrow the baker, noticed subtler shifts. Patients who left Greystone spoke slower. Some no longer recognized old friends. One man had to relearn the names of his own children. Yet, all insisted they felt peace. And peace in Bellwether was in short supply. So the village said nothing. Even when the institute began operating at night. Even when new equipment arrived by covered cart, wheeled straight into the cellars through the south-facing door no one else had the key for. No one asked where the machines came from. No one asked where the patients went. Because when madness ceased to scream in the streets, who would dare disturb the hush? The theory was never formally published. Not in any known medical journal, nor presented at any society of practitioners. Yet, within the stone walls of Greystone, it was doctrine. Dr. Venn called it reverse cognition alignment, but to his staff it became known simply as the mirror method. The premise was as bold as it was unsettling that trauma madness and even moral failure were not rooted in what the mind had done, but in how it remembered doing it. He believed that memory was not static nor sacred, that it could be reshaped not by suggestion or hypnosis, but through carefully modulated light and harmonic resonance. The procedure, as outlined in sketches found decades later, involved a 3-stage sequence visual deconstruction through flicker induction tonal immersion, via low-frequency pulse, and finally, imprint synchronization, a process allegedly guided by what Venn referred to as the auric feedback loop. To the layperson it sounded like science fiction, but the patients, those chosen for deeper realignment, were rarely in a position to object. They were selected quietly often after standard treatments plateaued. Files indicate a pattern symptoms involving persistent guilt, recurring visions, or moral disassociation. These patients were guided sometimes under sedation to the restricted lower chambers. What happened there was never documented in full, but the effects were. Case 14. Oswin Baird. A former naval officer plagued by night terrors and compulsive muttering, underwent a 9-day regimen. Upon release, he claimed not to recognize the word ship. He smiled constantly. When asked about his past, he simply replied, "I have none." Case 22. Letitia Howe, who had survived a traumatic fire that claimed her family was treated with an extended flicker induction protocol. She emerged, speaking in meter, her sentences aligned to a rhythm not her own. Her left eye no longer responded to light. Case 37. Thomas Grieve, diagnosed with catatonic melancholia, was considered beyond recovery. He was chosen for what Venn labeled Phase 3. 3 days later, he was found tending to Greystone's herb garden, humming a melody unknown to any of the staff. When approached, he asked the groundskeeper, "Have you seen the reflection of your own breath?" Then he never spoke again. Not all treatments yielded such calm outcomes. Case 41 ended in physical collapse. No autopsy was conducted. Case 45 vanished entirely. Records suggest they were transferred, though no destination was listed. A margin note in faded ink reads, "Only too porous." Did not hold. Outside the Institute, the village grew quieter. The roads near Greystone were less traveled. Children avoided the perimeter hedge. Shopkeepers began closing early, not out of fear, but fatigue, as if the very air weighed heavier near that place. Inside, the staff adjusted. They operated by candlelight in the upper wards, but the lower chambers glowed faintly, even in darkness, powered by devices no one but Venn seemed able to maintain. Nurses began to wear earplugs in the stairwell leading down, not due to noise but vibration, like standing on the throat of a song one would later write. But perhaps the most telling sign that something had shifted came not from the patients but the clocks. Several timepieces within the Institute, specifically those nearest the lower floor, began to lose track, not seconds but hours. One nurse swore her shift lasted 15 minutes, yet 2 hours had passed. Another found her journal entries duplicated, written in her own hand, but with lines she didn't remember writing. The mirror method wasn't curing the mind. It was redirecting it, realigning thought not to comfort but to conformity. And in doing so, it seemed to ask one thing in return. Forget who you were, and let something else look out through your eyes. There was no mirror in the chamber, not even polished metal. No clock, no window, not a single surface in which a face might be reflected even by accident. They called it the reflection room, though privately the staff referred to it as the hollow. It was located at the end of a descending corridor sealed by a double lock system and accessible only with a set of bone-handled keys carried by Venn himself. To reach it, one had to pass 3 distinct thresholds: a vestibule that emitted a faint chime when entered a copper-framed door, etched with overlapping spirals, and finally a short stair into a circular chamber lit by a violet glow that didn't seem to come from any singular source. Few staff members had ever entered. Fewer spoke of what they saw. According to a surviving letter penned by junior nurse Lillian Greaves, patients chosen for the hollow were first pre-treated with a tincture known simply as Lucent. Described as colorless, odorless, and warm to the touch, it was administered in silence. The patient was then led down, never restrained, always encouraged to enter willingly. Some cried, others laughed. A few had to be reminded to keep walking, their bodies moving, as if pulled by something invisible. Inside the room, sound behaved strangely. Voices echoed before being spoken. Breathing became rhythmic. And in the center of the room stood a pedestal no taller than a child's toy chest, upon which rested what the nurses believed was the source of the resonance, a spherical instrument composed of thin coiled wires and faintly humming lenses. It moved, not constantly but in subtle adjustments, reacting to unseen signals like a compass disturbed by magnetic pull. Once inside, patients were asked a single question: "What part of you remembers the most?" Their answers were never recorded. What happened next was always private. Venn insisted on conducting the sessions himself, sometimes accompanied by his assistant, an older man known only as Shepherd, who had no official background and never spoke above a whisper. Patients remained inside for periods ranging from minutes to hours. When they returned, if they returned, they did not speak of what they'd seen. But there were signs. Mr. Cadwell, a solicitor from Bath, was sent to Greystone for nervous tremors and fits of disassociation. He was admitted to the reflection room after 5 days. Upon return, he spoke no longer in English but in a dialect later identified as a fragmented form of Etruscan. He showed no awareness of his own name. Miss Farrell, a governess suffering from melancholic paralysis, re-emerged from the chamber claiming to have seen the library behind her eyelids. Her drawings, feverishly scrawled across the margins of hymnals and bedding, showed a consistent symbol, a spiral within a spiral with a single dot at its center. When confronted, Venn would only smile. "Memory is layered," he said. "We're simply brushing away the outer dust." But dust doesn't whisper back. Nurse Greaves wrote of a moment one night when she remained too close to the reflection room after hours. The chamber had been sealed. No patients remained inside. Yet she heard breathing, not heavy or labored but collective, as if more than one presence waited behind the door, as if they knew her name. She never returned to the lower halls again. The staff grew cautious. Some began marking the calendar with black ink on nights when the resonance hummed through the floorboards. On those nights, even the oil lamps flickered differently, casting shadows and angles that defied reason. And in the town of Bellwether, people began waking with strange phrases on their tongues. One man reported that his wife had spoken a single sentence in her sleep: "Don't let them look through your thoughts." He hadn't the heart to ask what she meant. Because somewhere far below where medicine was supposed to live, something else was listening. And it didn't need mirrors to see. He was no one special. Just a boy with dirt under his nails and shoes patched twice over. His name was Elias Grafton, the youngest of 6, and like many children in Bellwether, he earned pennies running errands and shining boots for men who never asked his name. He was 12 when he vanished. It happened during the early days of November, when the moors turned to frost, and the Institute's chimneys pulsed with strange blue smoke. Elias had been seen that afternoon outside the general store trading jokes with the butcher's son. He carried his shoeshine kit over one shoulder, whistling a tune no one could place. That evening he didn't come home. At first, no one panicked. He'd stayed late before sweeping up at the tavern, sleeping by the stove in the stables. But by morning, when his kit was found outside the garden wall of Greystone's southern annex, worry set in. His mother went to the gates, hands trembling, voice hoarse from worry. The porter claimed he hadn't seen Elias. Dr. Venn himself emerged shortly after, calm and sympathetic, assuring her that if the boy had trespassed, he'd certainly have been noticed. "Children wander," he said gently. "The world is full of corners they think are safe." She didn't believe him. Neither did Mr. G. Whitlow, the apothecary, who knew Elias to be a cautious boy, too cautious to scale the stone wall, especially at night. The baker, Mrs. Merrow, claimed she'd seen a shadow flit past the third-floor window of the Institute just before midnight, a movement too small, she said, to be an adult. But they had no proof. 2 days passed. On the third morning, a package arrived at the Grafton doorstep. No note, no return address, wrapped in pale linen and tied with black thread. Inside was Elias's left shoe. It had been polished to a high gleam, the laces perfectly tied. But what struck everyone was the container. A box of cut crystal precisely crafted with a lid that clicked shut in a way that felt surgical. The mother fainted. The constable was called, but no evidence linked the box to anyone. The materials, glass, metal hinges, velvet lining, were unlike anything made locally, imported perhaps from where no one knew. That evening, the town held a meeting in the chapel. Quiet voices, restless glances. Someone mentioned Greystone. The name hung in the air like smoke. But no accusations were made, because by then no one wanted to lose their own to doubt, to risk being denied care, to suggest that peace might come with a cost too steep to bear. The next week, a second delivery came. Not to the Graftons, but to Mr. Whitlow. Another crystal box, this time containing a thin strip of paper. Upon it, a sentence written in perfect copperplate. He aligned too soon. That was all. The constable brought the box to Venn. The doctor studied it carefully, then nodded as if confirming something only he understood. "It's unfortunate," he said, "but not irreversible. The box was never returned." Within the month, a new patient wing opened, funded. It was whispered by a quiet donation from the Crown, routed through unnamed benefactors. More staff arrived, more equipment. The basement hum deepened. No one saw Elias again. But the night after the first frost, a stable hand reported hearing a boy's voice echo through the stables at twilight. It sang a lullaby with no melody. The words were out of order. But the voice was his. And when the man looked toward the trees, he swore he saw something gleam. Not eyes. Glass. Her name was Edith Cleary, and she was not the kind of woman who frightened easily. At 38, she had worked in foundling homes, cholera wards, and the makeshift barracks of military infirmaries. She'd seen bodies twitch after death, heard prayers rasped through blood. But what she witnessed during her 3rd year at Greystone was unlike anything she could explain, at least not with the language she had used before. Edith joined the Institute in 1875 as a ward matron. She managed linens, monitored sleeping schedules, kept careful notes on meal intake and patient routines. Greystone, at first glance, was well run. Precise. Too precise. Patients didn't improve gradually. They pivoted, changed suddenly after a session, returning with steady voices and vacant eyes. Curious, she began comparing records. She noticed a pattern in the discharge books, patients marked with a small circle in the margin, often left without collecting their belongings. Their beds remained made. No departure notes, no family signatures, no witnesses. Just a line drawn through their name with the word "released," and a time always between 2:50 and 3:10 a.m. The time never varied more than 20 minutes. She began keeping her own ledger, hiding it in the hollow space beneath the dry pantry floorboard of the west kitchen. She copied names, entry dates, symptoms, and when available, the final remarks. There were dozens by the time she reached the bottom of the first column. One line chilled her more than the others. Patient 67, M.R. Speech onset in reversed syntax. Lucent administered. Phase 2 incomplete. Outcome absorption. Absorption, it wasn't a term she'd seen before, nor was Phase 2 a known designation. She asked discreetly around the staff. Most shrugged. One young orderly paled and shook his head. "That's below," he whispered. It wasn't long before she began tracking the use of Lucent more carefully. It was a clear tincture stored in a locked cabinet labeled preparatory only. Officially, it was meant to calm patients before sensory exposure. But she saw something else. Patients given Lucent didn't just calm, they stilled. Their expressions grew slack, their gaze fixed not outward, but somewhere behind the eyes. They responded to voices not with emotion, but precision, as if repeating learned phrases. And then, some vanished. She listed 17 such disappearances over 4 months. In each case, Lucent had been administered within 48 hours of the patient's last documented activity. She tried raising questions. Not directly to Venn, he was rarely available, but to his assistant Shepherd. He listened, smiled faintly. "We don't lose people," he said. "But they're not accounted for," she pressed. "Their families never collect them. There are no transfer records." He folded a towel with exquisite care. "We realign what cannot be followed." She reported it to the local parish. The vicar nodded politely and changed the subject. She wrote to the county board. No reply. And then one evening, she returned to her quarters to find her own name penciled into the staff rota under a new heading, Observation candidate. No explanation. No signature. She tore the page from the ledger, burned it in the stove, and packed her bag. But before she left, she slid her hidden notebook into a wrapped oilcloth and wedged it under the loose pantry board. Someday, she hoped someone would find it. Someone who still understood the difference between healing and disappearing. Because at Greystone, there were no bodies buried, but names. Names were buried all the time. The bell had no rope, no lever, no visible mechanism. It hung in a recessed alcove above the old chapel wing, an ornate bronze casting with filigree spirals etched along its rim, its surface darkened by time, but untouched by soot or rust. No one knew when it was installed. It wasn't part of the original Greystone blueprint, and no staff recalled seeing it during their first weeks at the Institute. Yet, by late 1876, everyone heard it. It rang once, and always at the same time, 3:03 a.m. The first to mention it was a night porter, a man named Hale, who asked whether there had been a funeral. When told there hadn't, he grew pale. Then, who he asked was it for others began noticing the pattern. Each time the bell rang, a patient was marked as released. The files showed the same recurring timestamp scribbled in Ven's hand. 3:03, again and again. And though patients who remained above ground never heard it, those who lived near Greystone villagers' caretakers' deliverymen began to describe strange dreams on those nights. They were always dreams of waiting. Some saw themselves in long corridors with no walls, just endless lines of doors that opened into more doors. Others dreamt of a voice calling them by name, only to turn and find a hallway of mirrors, each reflecting a version of themselves they didn't recognize. One woman, the wife of the town's schoolteacher, awoke one morning speaking an unfamiliar phrase aloud. "You must not answer until it forgets your name." When her husband asked what she meant, she couldn't recall speaking at all. Clocks near the Institute began malfunctioning. Not violently, subtly. Minute hands that paused for too long, pendulums that moved without sound, watches that lost track of hours but kept perfect seconds. Mr. Whitlow, the apothecary, noted that every time he passed the Greystone perimeter, his pocket chronometer reset to midnight. Animals reacted worse. Dogs refused to walk past the western gate. Horses pulled away from the stone road. Cats disappeared entirely for days at a time, only to return wild-eyed and silent. Still, no one confronted Ven, because the Institute continued to perform miracles, at least on the surface. Children stopped hearing voices. Veterans stopped screaming in their sleep. Women, once paralyzed by sorrow, now tended their gardens with vacant smiles. And when asked how they felt, they all said the same thing, quieter. But it wasn't peace. It was muting, a kind of hush that didn't come from relief, but from subtraction, like something inside them had been turned down or scraped clean. And then came the frost. On the first night it crept across the moors, a woman named Eliza Harrow. A recent patient woke screaming. She claimed she saw herself walking outside her own window barefoot in the snow, wearing the nightgown she'd worn during her treatment. When Edith Cleary, still secretly collecting names, visited her the next day, Eliza couldn't remember what she'd said, only that the bell had rung, and something inside her chest had chimed back. Edith marked the time in her notes, 3:03. And beside it, she drew a small spiral. One turn in, one turn out. His name was Samuel Dorr. He was 10 years old and had never spoken a word in his life. His mother, a weaver's daughter from West Bellwether, said he had been born silent, not sickly, not impaired, just quiet. Doctors called it congenital mutism. Priests suggested it was a mark of spiritual purity. Samuel simply watched the world with large, steady eyes as though language were something he'd already outgrown. But in the autumn of 1877, after a prolonged fever left him listless and unable to eat, he was admitted to Greystone on recommendation from a parish sponsor. His mother was hesitant. She had heard the murmurs, the dreams, the bell, but Van met her at the gates himself, placing a warm hand over hers. Some voices, he said, are simply waiting for the right resonance. Samuel was given a private room. He didn't resist treatment. He didn't flinch at the first administration of Lucent. According to the nurse on duty, his heartbeat slowed but remained strong, his breath even. The following morning he spoke. Not in English. Not in any language his mother recognized, but with fluency. The words came slow, rhythmic, melodic. He began with small phrases, repeated cadences that echoed through the quiet of the ward. A staff member transcribed them phonetically. When sent to the university in York, a professor of linguistics responded with quiet alarm. The phrases bore structural resemblance to Linear A, a pre-Greek language long considered undecipherable, last seen on ancient Cretan tablets. The boy, it seemed, was reciting something forgotten. But that was only the beginning. Within days, Samuel began drawing. He used charcoal from the fireplace, chalk from the stone garden path, whatever he could find. He filled his walls with shapes, cascading spirals, branching glyphs, not quite letters, not quite numbers. He refused food, but thrived physically. He slept less, blinking less, speaking only when spoken to and always with the same calm, distant tone. One night, a junior nurse found him whispering to himself, repeating sequences of numbers: 9 digits, pause, 8 digits, pause. When written down and submitted to the local constable for curiosity, the numbers were forwarded to a railway surveyor. They matched the precise coordinates of a foundry in Vienna. Later, sequences were confirmed to align with a psychiatric facility in Marseille, a warehouse in Bremen, and a disused monastery in northern Spain, locations with no clear connection except that each had received anonymous shipments from England over the prior 2 years. Shipments listed only as medical artifacts, non-fragile. When asked what the numbers meant, Samuel replied with one of his few phrases in English. They remember better when they're disassembled. His mother pulled him from the institute days later, weeping and pale. But by then, Samuel's drawings had spread. Other children began tracing similar shapes in their porridge. One girl sketched a spiral onto her window pane with breath and fingertip. Another wrote the same number sequence in the dirt behind the chapel. The words might have been foreign, but the pattern was becoming familiar, as if Samuel hadn't been given a voice, but had become one. He arrived without fanfare. Inspector Thaddeus Aldwych was not a man of flourish or spectacle. Sent by the Royal Board of Medical Ethics, he had been tasked with reviewing institutions rumored to have unorthodox practices. Greystone was third on his list. He expected a week of paperwork, a perfunctory interview, and perhaps a note or two on excessive use of ambient therapy. He did not expect to feel watched before he crossed the front gate. Dr. Venn greeted him with impeccable manners, offering tea, a tour, and a private chamber in the East Wing. The institute was on its surface pristine. Staff moved with silent efficiency. Patients, red-painted, walked gardens with measured calm. The very walls seemed to hum with order, but order Aldwych knew could be curated. He began with the ledgers. At first, they appeared flawless: dates, entries, symptoms, observations. But when he flipped to the discharge records, he noticed something odd. For every 10 admissions, only 3 had full discharge entries. The rest were marked simply as released, followed by a date and time, 3:03 a.m. always. He requested interviews with former patients. Venn offered written testimonials instead. Many of our residents prefer not to reopen wounds, he said kindly. Our work is built on closure. That night, Aldwych remained awake long after the lamps dimmed. The east wing offered a narrow view of the rear annex, where, according to the architectural map, no windows should have existed. Yet he saw one faintly flickering pane, pulsing like a heartbeat. At 3:03, the bell rang. The next morning, Aldwych asked to observe a treatment session. Venn declined. Our methods, he explained, require environmental sensitivity. Observation changes the outcome. The brain knows when it's being watched. Later that day, while exploring the chapel wing, Aldwych noticed something behind the altar, a seam in the stone. He pressed his hand against it. A section gave way, revealing a small metallic panel with a thin circular slot. He didn't touch it, but he heard something beyond the wall. Not movement, not machinery. Breathing. That night, he wandered beyond the staff quarters under the guise of sleeplessness. Near the west stairwell, he passed two nurses whispering in low tones, exchanging an object that gleamed briefly under moonlight. It was a vial, clear and faintly glowing. Lucent. He asked no questions, only listened. It's not for healing, one said. It's for entry. The next day, Venn offered him a second tour, smiling, generous, attentive. But Aldwych noticed his language had changed, more circular, less specific, as though he were avoiding nouns altogether. We shepherd resonance, Venn said, not recovery. That evening, Aldwych wrote a letter to his superiors. Recommend further audit. Records suggest intentional obfuscation. Patient fate unclear. Facility exhibits signs of unauthorized chemical use. Spiritual terminology masks clinical operations. Additional concern: presence of equipment not found in any medical registry. Request immediate second inquiry. He folded the letter, sealed it, and hid it in the sole of his boot, because by then he had already decided. He would find the source of the pulse behind the chapel. Even if it meant entering the room no one would name. It was the gardener who told him, not with words but with a glance, a gesture, and a muttered warning. You didn't see this from me. The man was nearly 60, with weathered skin and a gait shaped by a life of shovels and frostbitten mornings, but he had watched, longer than most. He led Aldwych to the far edge of the property, past a stone wall lined with bramble, toward a storage cellar hidden beneath a tool shed. The lock was old, but it had been oiled recently. Inside were crates, dozens of them stacked and tagged in crisp handwriting. Most bore markings in German nicht zerbrechlich, for Anneliese and all were stamped with the same symbol, a spiral encased in a ring of serpents. Beneath the sigil were numbers, lot references, batch codes, shipment lines. Aldwych pried one open. Inside was a brass cylinder sealed with wax containing folded parchment diagrams and what appeared to be slivers of preserved tissue suspended in gel. One diagram showed a cross-section of the brain overlaid with notations in Latin and French sections labeled memory, elasticity, oral, entrapment zone, and sequence transfer point. Another crate contained glass slides labeled with dates initials and an unfamiliar scale marked RNI Resonant Neural Index. At the bottom of the third crate was a bundle of letters. Some were written in French, others in clipped technical English. But they shared a single recipient, the MH Consortium care of A. Langheim, Marseille facility. The content was unmistakable. They were updates, performance reviews, detailed accounts of procedures outcomes and subject durability. They spoke of pre-language imprinting, lossless transmission curves, and favorable resistance in pediatric vessels. One paragraph stood out. Subjects under lucent influence maintain pliability up to 14 minutes post-transfer. Increased exposure to harmonic waveforms elevates imprint success rate by 37%. Recommend accelerated procurement for colonial testing sites. These weren't treatments. They were trials, and Greystone wasn't a hospital, it was a processing site. Aldwich's hands trembled as he copied a section into his pocket notebook. He didn't take the originals he knew better than to leave obvious gaps. But he took something else, a brass seal loose at the bottom of the final crate. It matched the symbol above the hidden panel in the chapel, the serpent, the spiral, the ring. He returned to his room in silence, locked the door, hid the notebook under the mattress. That night, he dreamed of windows without glass, of voices without mouths, of something crawling through memory like it was soil planting and harvesting in the dark. When he awoke, the seal burned cold in his pocket, and from the hallway beyond his door he heard footsteps that didn't belong to any human gait. Slow, metallic, waiting. She arrived with a red shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Eliza Harrow had spent most of her life stitching together other people's comfort through baking, through letters, through hymns hummed in kitchens no longer warm. But after her second stillbirth and the winter that followed, something inside her began to unravel. The local doctor prescribed rest. The vicar offered prayer. But it was the pamphlet that changed everything. A single sheet left at the church steps bearing the Greystone crest and an invitation. For those carrying a sorrow too quiet for words, there is resonance. She didn't tell her daughter. Celeste was 16 and away at school. By the time she returned for the spring holiday, Eliza was gone. Her belongings had been packed neatly in the hall chest. Her last grocery list lay untouched on the counter. But on her bedside table sat a sealed envelope addressed in her looping hand for when the bell rings. Inside was a single line. If you hear it, call your name, do not answer. Not even in thought. There was no date, no signature. Just the scent of dried lavender and something else, something sharp, like metal warmed in the sun. Celeste wrote to Greystone. She received a prompt reply. Mrs. Harrow has entered retreat and is not accepting visitors. Your concern is noted and appreciated. Rest assured, she is at peace. There were no further details, no expected duration, no promise of return. And then 3 weeks later, a parcel arrived at the Harrow home. It contained Eliza's red shawl perfectly folded and a small silver pin in the shape of a spiral. No note. Celeste brought it to the constable, then to the vicar, then finally to the librarian, each step feeling more desperate than the last. Only the librarian said something useful. "I've seen this symbol," she murmured. "Not in a book, on a shipment. Years ago, from Vienna." The librarian didn't know what the shipment contained, only that it was routed through the same agency that once chartered anatomical specimens from war zones for study. Quiet work, authorized by no one, paid by everyone. That night, Celeste sat by the fireplace with her mother's envelope in her lap. She hadn't heard the bell, not yet, but she listened for it in every corner of silence. And in the embers she swore she saw the reflection of her own face blink just half a second too late. Eliza Harrow was never officially listed among the 305 released, but her name appeared in the final column of Edith Cleary's hidden ledger, underlined twice. Beside it, a note in trembling ink. No return. Spiral adapted. Room sealed afterward. Celeste didn't sleep that night. She packed a satchel, and at first light she walked the road to Greystone not as a daughter seeking reunion, but as someone ready to unearth what had been laid beneath 14 years of curated forgetting. She arrived just after dusk, when the moors exhaled fog, and the lanterns at the Institute glowed low behind thick glass. Celeste had timed it carefully. She knew the staff rotations. She knew which door had a faulty latch, one her mother had mentioned in passing years before while mending the hem of a church curtain. She slipped inside through the north annex, past shuttered examination rooms and portraits with dust-like veils over their eyes. The halls smelled faintly of vinegar and pressed linen, but beneath it lay something older, earthier, the scent of stone long soaked in silence. In her coat pocket was a folded map, hand-sketched with annotations in her mother's script. It marked a route not found in any Greystone blueprint, a narrow stair behind the herbarium shelving, leading to what Eliza had called the inner chamber. The steps descended in irregular spirals hewn from dark limestone, the walls etched with ridges worn smooth by touch. As Celeste moved downward, she noticed that the air did not grow colder, but warmer, denser, like breath exhaled from deep machinery. At the base of the stair, a door waited. It was made of copper and glass, paneled with thin veins of greenish light that pulsed, every few seconds faint like a heartbeat heard through fabric. There was no handle, only a plate circular marked with a spiral groove. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the silver pin returned with her mother's shawl. It fit the groove perfectly. The door hissed. Inside the floor was soft, covered in layered cloth like soundproofing in a chamber meant to absorb echoes, not just from walls, but from thought. The room was round-lined with consoles and curved glass panels that reflected nothing. At its center stood the source of the light, a device that did not resemble any known machine. It hovered, not visibly supported, not hung. It simply remained in place, suspended above a dais of etched metal, slowly rotating. It emitted no heat, only hum. Celeste stepped closer. Beneath the device, in small compartments carved into the walls, she saw the contents. Cylinders, labeled, dated, and one marked with her mother's initials E.H. Beside it, resonance achieved, memory softened, containment stable. She reached for it but stopped. The hum changed. It began to pulse faster, like recognition, like welcome. Then came the sound, not external, not in the ears. A voice, her mother's clear, even unblinking. You shouldn't be here, love. But now that you are, you have to see. The walls shifted. Projected across the glass panels were images, memories not hers. A hand writing in ink. A hallway with no end. A child walking backward into light. A voice chanting in reverse cadence. A bell that tolled in a place without time. And behind it all, a pattern. Not narrative. Not logic. Just a spiral. Moving inward. Always inward. Celeste stumbled back. The device above her clicked once, then again. Then it began to descend. The device descended slowly like a lantern lowered through still water. Celeste took a step back, but the floor beneath her no longer felt fixed. With each pulse from the machine, the walls of the chamber seemed to soften, glass bending slightly, not shattering but curving inward, as though reacting to her breath. And then the voice returned. It wasn't quite her mother's anymore. Still warm, still familiar, but stretched, like something trying to remember how to sound human. Do you remember the orchard? It asked gently. You fell from the ladder. Your knees bled. You didn't cry. Celeste did remember, but she hadn't told anyone that memory, not even her mother. You buried the apple with the worm still inside, the voice added. You thought it would grow again, but you forgot to mark the soil. She looked up. The device now hovered eye level, its smooth surface unfolding like petals of light, revealing smaller inner structures, glass threads, fluid spirals, pulsing centers that blinked in sequence. All around her, the wall panels activated, not with images, with fragments. 305 of them, each one flickering independently, a name, a face, a sentence unfinished. Some laughed, some wept. One woman stared directly into Celeste's eyes and whispered, I didn't say yes. Another, a child's face, mouthed a sequence of numbers, over and over. Some of the cylinders sparked briefly, then fell dark. She turned, searching for a door, but there was none. The chamber had sealed. She reached for her mother's vial, the one labeled EH. But the moment her fingers touched it, the voice sharpened. "That's not for you." The light pulsed red. The spiral device emitted a low tone that vibrated her teeth not painfully, but decisively. A message beneath language. Then came the rush. A cascade of sensations, not memories, not thoughts, uploads. Floods of experience not her own. She felt herself shivering in a field she'd never walked, mourning a brother she never had, screaming in a dialect she couldn't speak. Then silence, and a single phrase. "You are suitable." The spiral halted its rotation. For the first time since entering the chamber, the air stilled. One panel near the floor clicked open. Inside was a small compartment, a viewing slot, and through it Celeste saw something she would never describe again, not even to herself. It was shaped like a child, but not formed like one. Its surface gleamed like wet parchment, its mouth open in quiet terror. Its eyes were her own. She stumbled backward, the vial still clutched in her hand. The lights dimmed. One final message appeared across every wall, etched in letters of moving light. Memory is inheritance. Spirals do not end. They are only paused. She screamed not from fear, but refusal. The spiral responded. It began to ascend once more. And with its lift, a door opened in the opposite wall, soundless, unnoticed until that moment. She ran. She did not look back, but the walls did. The corridor beyond the chamber was narrower than she expected, barely wide enough for her shoulders, lined with piping that pulsed faintly like veins under skin. Celeste didn't know how long she ran. The hallway curved in ways that defied the geometry of the building above. It felt like moving through the inside of something alive, something not built but grown. In her palm, she still clutched the vial marked EH, and around her neck, swinging with every footfall, was the pin, the spiral. The passage ended abruptly at a hatch with no markings, only a triangular plate and a shallow indentation. She pressed the spiral pin into the groove. The hatch hissed open. The air hit her like a slap, cool, real earthy. She was in the furnace yard. Above her, Greystone loomed against the night sky, its chimneys breathing slow streams of blue-gray smoke. The eastern wing was still lit, windows glowing soft gold, but she could feel the rhythm beneath the ground, something stirring, something aware of her exit. She didn't run yet. She turned back and pulled from her coat a matchbook from the chapel vestibule where candles were once sold to patients for reflection. She lit the match, touched it to the spiral pin. It flared a burst of magnesium white so sudden she nearly dropped it. The pin began to vibrate, humming in her fingers. She placed it at the base of the furnace door. There, stamped in the metal, was a small line of text she'd never seen before. Sequence active upon disconnection. She didn't know what it meant. But when she pulled the pin free, the vibration stopped, and the pipes beneath her feet began to scream. Not audibly, not for the ears, but the ground itself seemed to recoil. She turned and ran. As she passed the herbarium wall, glass exploded outward behind her in a rush of heat and light. The soil lit with brief blue fire, then fell into silence. From the main hall a bell rang, not once, but 3 times. Long, slow, final. By the time she reached the edge of the moor, Celeste could see the first flame crawling up the chapel tower. People were gathering, their faces lit orange in the glow. Some stood motionless. Some wept. But no one moved to save the building. Because in that moment they all understood. The healing had never come from medicine. It had come from removal, from replacement, from forgetting. Celeste dropped to her knees, the vial still warm in her hand, and sobbed not because she had escaped, but because she knew what was still inside her. Not memories. Something deeper. Something recorded. The voice was quiet now, but it had not left. And in the distant crackle of fire she heard it whisper, "Thank you for making space." It took 3 days for the fire to go out. By the time federal agents arrived, nothing of Greystone stood taller than a fractured archway, and the remains of the bell cracked clean through, half buried in ash. But the foundation still pulsed with heat. Celeste Harrow handed over the vial. The documents. The sketches retrieved from the chamber walls. Her voice was hoarse, her hands blistered. She said very little, not because she was hiding anything, but because too much had already passed through her. She was escorted to an infirmary 3 towns over, placed under observation, and treated for trauma-induced hallucinations. She never contradicted the diagnosis. She knew better. The officials cataloged what they could. Brass cylinders warped by heat, engravings that resisted polishing, tattered ledgers with notations in 3 languages and at least 2 that no one recognized. One investigator, a professor from Edinburgh, disappeared after 2 days on site. He left behind a single line in his notebook. They weren't trying to heal. They were trying to preserve. Soon after, a sealed letter arrived at the regional office in London. It bore the crest of the Order of St. Umbra, a shadow division within the church long tasked with monitoring unexplained theological phenomena. The letter was marked confidential. Inside, confirmation of satellite activity. 1 line underlined twice. Facility in Marseille exhibiting parallel schema. Subject range 0-14 years. Pattern consistent with Greystone. Spiral intact. There would be no trial. The Greystone Trust had been dissolved the year prior, absorbed into a holdings company with no board, no location, no trace. Dr. Alaric Venn was never found. No birth records, no professional accreditation. His name appeared only in one other context, a letter addressed from Bremen, referencing a successful dry run at Bellwether. The town never rebuilt the institute, but the land remained warm long into winter. Animals still refused to graze near the ruin. Children were told stories of ash and silence. A single plaque was placed at the site years later. It read, "In memory of those who sought peace," but peace had never been the goal. Not really. Memory was the currency, and silence the receipt. Celeste returned to Bellwether briefly in 1892. She kept to herself, planted nothing, took in no boarders. She left again within the year. Some say she moved to the coast, others that she married and changed her name. But in the margins of one medical journal, unsigned, unattributed, unread by most, was an annotation scrawled in ink, nearly too faded to read. The spiral is not a symbol, it is an operating system. And once a year, on the anniversary of the fire, travelers passing through the edge of Bellwether report hearing a sound not carried by wind, a bell. 3 tones, low, precise, remembered. Not a warning, not a hymn, just a pattern waiting to begin again. Because memory doesn't die, it only waits for a new host.